Thanks, John. I like to walk and talk, so standing at the podium is going to drive me bananas. I'm Bryna. This is a photograph of me in Quang Dina. He's the Chief Resilience Officer in Da Nang, Vietnam. And in this image, we're in New Orleans. And we're at our first Chief Resilience Officers sort of summit in New Orleans, just about 10 years after Hurricane Katrina. And I don't know that everyone in this room knows, but there's a deep affiliation between Vietnamese communities and New Orleans. And so one of the things that I think I'll be talking about today is how we learn from others. And how, when you think about evoking change in communities, those lessons come from very, very special places. The Vietnamese community in New Orleans was struck very hard after Hurricane Katrina. They were a large fishing community, but they were also one of the quickest to recover and show us what forms of resilience we need to be looking for within the communities, within the distinct communities within each city. I love this quote. I love Mark Twain, so I tend to love this quote. I'm a big believer in learning by doing. I think all of the things that are written in the great books all across Harvard are absolutely wonderful, but you will never learn it until you actually do it. And when the pain actually comes to you from being bitten time and time again, that's where wisdom actually comes from. So early in my career, in my early days, I had nothing to do with the built environment, nothing to do with architecture or design or even cities. But I was involved at an early age in partnerships work, partnerships being a very big term of our day that philanthropy in particular likes to use a lot. But partnerships at the time for me was working in major licensing and consumer marketing programs. You might recognize this image of Pepsi and episode 1 of Star Wars, where we did major sort of sweepstakes programs with retailers like 7-Eleven. I like to forget about these days, but I think it's important to understand that partnerships work when you're doing it is some of the hardest work that there is. It sounds very sexy, but the thin sliver where interests actually align is where you can get work done. And that's very, very rare. And in the private sector, it's clearly known, right? There's market-driven outcomes where those interests align. But in the public sector or in the philanthropic sector, sometimes those things are very opaque, where interests align. So taking some of this knowledge, I transitioned at the turn of the century. I like to be able to say that because it makes me sound so old and wise, the turn of the century. I transitioned into the built environment at the turn of the century. I moved to Sydney, Australia to study architecture, and it was a great wonderful education program steeped in a lot of architectural history and theory programs, deep and rich in environmental lore of the country. But what it was lacking was any practical affiliation with the community. So here we are learning all of these sort of great insights about building and design, and we weren't actually ever talking to the communities we are theoretically building for. And I saw in my fellow students this lack of ability to actually be able to connect their ideas with the people they were supposed to be working for. And furthermore, how were we going to really think about these large-scale planning endeavors we were working on without speaking to the Department of Planning or the government architect, which Australia has at every state level? So I decided to kick it with my architecture career, throw that to the side, and really get heavily involved in advocacy for the built environment. How do you bring government together with those who are building and doing in the built environment, and those who are coming up and need to be mentored in their craft to have real practical application. So I launched a design competition in Sydney called Sydney 2020. Now remember again, this was turn of the century, so 2020 was vast off into the horizon. And it was the first actual public engagement program Sydney ever did with its visioning of itself for the future within a public context. This was 2000. It received really great major acclaim, and then one of my professors said to me, "Do you think you might be able to do that? We're working on this thing with the UN called the Millennium Development Goals. Do you think you might be able to do that with some of the students that are working around in our universities, some of the low-income communities that were thinking about slums and slum development around the world, and really think about how people have voice in their place in the development world and try to help us connect those dots." So that was early in my career. Another quote, "Only the wisest and stupidest of men never change." I think that this is a really compelling quote because what I've tended to find in a career where people actually hire me to be a change agent time and time again, come in and change our institutions, come in and change our governments, come in and change our systems, the early manifestation of that is, let's do this quickly. Shouldn't innovation be quick? Isn't it easy to get stuff done? Find a bunch of energetic young folks and let's just go get it done. So that's one side of the spectrum. And then, of course, the other side of the spectrum is the wisest who've been around for a long, long time and who know and who've tried again and again to make that change and who have been beaten down and who are the bureaucrats in government who have learned that change is one of the most difficult things and the wisest path could be to accept that fate. So I went on to the National Building Museum. I'd love to see a raise of hands. Anybody know what the National Building Museum in this room? Oh my goodness. Teachers, get your students down to DC for a studio. The National Building Museum is the United States heritage museum about the building arts and sciences. It's in Washington, D.C., has fantastic exhibitions on everything from contemporary architecture to social justice issues to the history of what the home is. They do a lot of public education programs, and many of you will recognize this image of one of my favorite architects who is such an extraordinary gentleman, Shigeru Ban. And one of the things that I'm most proud about at the National Building Museum is they actually asked me to come in and make big change. So I was the head of public and government affairs. They wanted to affiliate with the national government. We're just a few blocks from Congress. And how might we actually lobby Congress to get interested in the building arts and sciences and take a vantage point from all of these exhibitions and public programs that we do? And Shigeru Ban came down and started working with our students who come from the Washington, D.C. community and some poor, very disadvantaged schools on the other side of the Anacostia River who very, very rarely get to speak to a starchitect like Shigeru Ban. So I began to learn that while I was up marshaling forces in Congress trying to lobby and advocate for resources, Shigeru Ban quietly came to town and worked with a bunch of young students to help them think about their community in the Anacostia River. Many of those students now, I'm really proud to say, have actually gone on to find careers in the city, in local government, be really interested in planning. And that little seed of what he planted that day, I tend to think is much more profound an outcome than potentially the millions of dollars that I got an institution from Congress. What does that lead to? What does his kind of work quietly helping 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds understand planning in the built environment? I went from there to HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Many of you are probably familiar. And I was the director of the Office of International and Philanthropic Innovation. A very small office, a powerful group of 5 people. Again, I use that term innovation. It shows up a lot these days in titles. And our job was to really try to shake up this dusty agency. HUD had been renowned for its terrible marks in employee satisfaction and in growth and development. It had the highest rate of those of any government agency set to retire. And so it wasn't getting a lot of that new energy in. So we changed the international office, which used to do sort of trainings for people who would come in overseas to learn about our housing policy, to really try to help from within and help HUD understand the different policies that it could learn from foreign governments or philanthropic investments. These 2 images up here, sustainable communities. Government's really hard. It is really hard to do a lot in government. HUD has its hands tied due to a lot of federal regulation, and believe it or not, these 3 agencies, Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agencies, could very rarely actually work together, and they couldn't pool investment. So those of you who are working in transit-oriented development, think about that. If HUD in housing cannot pool its investments with the Department of Transportation, and we're trying to do things sustainably, and we can't coordinate our dollars with the EPA, what does that actually look like in communities on the ground? So a lot of our work was trying to build traction around that and work with large philanthropies like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Cerdna, and so forth, to try to get all of our investment into one space to maximize those dollars. On the international side, we would work a lot with ministries from around the world. We worked really closely with Brazil on major programs like Minha Casa Minha Vida, which was their very large public housing program to try to exchange ideas and best practices. I note this down here. Probably some of you know the Resilience by Design competition, Rebuild by Design, and the National Resilience competition. It was one of the really major innovations under the Obama administration where rather than just FEMA recovery dollars flowing in after Hurricane Sandy, we started to think really strategically about how to rebuild back better with what communities were wanting and needing rather than rebuild the exact same way. And then 100RC came knocking at the door. They asked if I wanted a job. I said, sure. And so me and 2 others co-founded 100 Resilient Cities. And at the time, I was told, I've never looked this up to have any evidence or proof, that it was the largest single philanthropic investment in a program that had ever historically happened before. And it was also a really, really big burden because when I started thinking about it with my partners and our founders, we didn't want this to be just another big philanthropic scheme, another big grand idea that didn't have impact on the ground. And when you really think about the money, $100 million at the time in 100 cities, that's really not a lot to insert change into cities after all. And so we began to design a program of how we could influence within cities major long-term sustainable change. So we started thinking very carefully about the people we might influence. And from that was born the Chief Resilience Officer that is transplanted now, that idea into governments in 100 cities around the world, and has began to help governments, their mayors, their elected officials really rethink, hopefully over time, that there should be a person responsible for looking across the horizon and integrating 21st century risks not only into planning, but also into development and implementation. Boston, of course, is one of our member cities. There are about 33 in the United States. That's starting to expand. And then around the world in places like Washington City and Rio, where we worked with, Jakarta, Indonesia, Sydney, 54 countries across the world. But what I really, and I got my 5-minute flash, but what I really want to come to and what I've really been struggling with is the idea that the new and the change can be unsustainable. And that those who have been there, who have been in government, who have been in service, have knowledge and wisdom. And we need to figure out how to bring those change agents together with those who understand systems and who are dedicated to persevere decade after decade in order to get things done, because that's actually how cities work. In the image on the right, there's a gentleman at HUD. His name is Ron Ashford. I don't know if anybody here knows Ron, but he is the head of services at Public and Indian Housing. Actually, he's retired after 30 years of service at HUD. And what you're seeing here is an image at a public housing. I think that this is in Atlanta. And what Ron innovated after working for 20 years beating his head against the wall and trying to get this done was a Father's Day program at public housing, where fathers who abandoned their children, he was trying to bring them back together again and give these parents an entryway and an access way to come back together with their families. It took him 20 years to get support and funding for that program at HUD. But what an extraordinary idea and what an extraordinary man. Sometimes it's the simplest things, but it takes that dedicated professional to toil. What you see in this picture is Cedric Grant of New Orleans. Cedric was the basically head of infrastructure in New Orleans and worked both in the Nagin and Landrieu administrations. And Cedric, again, is one of those unsung heroes that if it weren't for him, no one would really know how those infrastructure systems, how those water systems worked. New Orleans has a specialized system that Einstein actually developed. Not Einstein. Help me out here. The other inventor. Edison, thank you. A special Edison switch, thank you very much. He had a special Edison switch that was actually developed for one of their systems that Cedric, as an engineer, has had to replicate and replicate and replicate time and time again. And every time Cedric tried to bring somebody in to kind of train and take his place so he could retire, the private sector would go in and hire that person or those people away, and so Cedric could never retire, so he kept on toiling and toiling and toiling again. And so I really want to know, and what I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about is, how do we more appropriately balance the ideas of innovation and scaling and return on impact and doing pilots, all of these sort of sexy terms that philanthropy is just deeply devoted to, and that the newcomers in policy and in politics are moved and motivated by how to get these things done in 4 years. How do we balance that out and celebrate and create spaces for continuity and durability, commitment and patience and depth in the wisdom that exists already within those folks who's been toiling time and time again? I feel like if we could marry the two sides of that spectrum, we'd have a much more just and much healthier and resilient communities. Thank you.